From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
This is an interview in 1999 with rock star David Bowie. He made rock records, damn good ones, for a living. But his second job might have been a futurist. Bowie was asked by a BBC journalist on what he thought of the internet.
It's just a tool, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. No, it's an alien life form. It's their life on Mars. Yes, it's just landed here.
The internet, as we now know it, didn't exist then. Google was in its infancy and hadn't become a verb yet. If you had access to the internet, you used dial-up to log on, which makes this next thought all the more prescient about the lives we live now, how we use social media and technology, and how it uses us.
It's simply a different delivery system there. You're arguing about something more profound.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about the actual context, and the state of content is going to be so different to anything that we can really envisage at the moment, where the interplay between the user and the provider will be so in simpatico, it's going to crush our ideas of what mediums are all about.
He was right. On social media, we're the user and the provider. The pictures, tweets, videos, and the things we buy online is all data, golden data, to social media companies and businesses. The internet cannot be separated from the way we live our lives. Should we scale it back? Can we? We're talking to Ron Deibert, technology expert and the director of Citizen Lab, a digital security research group. Ron gave the 2020 Massey lectures about how our relationship with the internet has evolved, often in toxic ways, and he's the author of the book Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. We're confronting the costs of technology and asking whether it's time to make a hard reset to all of it. Ron, thanks for taking the time to join us on the podcast.
My pleasure to be here with you.
I wanted to acknowledge just right off the top that it's really only because of technology that you and I can see each other right now, that we can talk over Zoom. So it's indisputable that technology has made our lives better in innumerable ways, right? And easier. But how deeply has technology and social media embedded itself in our lives?
Well, obviously, those of us of my age, I can see you're a bit younger than me, but those of us who are my age and have lived before and after social media can really appreciate the depth of the changes that have gone on over the last really 10 years. Like, it's a remarkably short period of time for something so profound to happen. And, there were changes leading up to it. Even you could go back 100 years, but the acceleration of immersive technology, connected technology, devices that we carry around with us at all times that are connected to the internet and moving into the Internet of Things. This is really something that has only happened within the last 10 years, accelerating profoundly over the last, 7 to 5, having to do with the business model of social media, which at its heart is about applying as many sensors as possible around users in order to gather as much data as they can as we go about our daily lives. So it's that underlying business model which drives the immersion that we see and the embeddedness of all the technology that surrounds us. As it stands, I think we're really only at the beginning of a steep uphill curve. If trends continue, we're likely to see a lot more connected devices as a matter of routine in our daily lives.
In your book Reset and in your Massey lectures about social media and digital technology, you call for a reset in how we use technology. Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. One, the bulk of the book is a distillation of all of the various pathologies of social media. In setting out to write this book, I wanted to kind of synthesize what I saw as an emerging conventional wisdom about all of the problems and how we might explain them. But I wanted to go further than that because, I've been doing research in this area for a long time. And especially lately, I think there is a dawning recognition by a lot of people that we have these big problems, but very little in terms of systematic recommendations for how to repair all of this. And given that we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is, a historical event, certainly once in a lifetime for most people, we have this opportunity to kind of take stock of where we're at. So those two combine, the fact that there is this growing gestalt, a kind of something in the air where people feel that.
Yeah. People are finally getting it. Yeah.
They're finally getting, okay, we've got something wrong here. And then also this kind of pause that we've had around our, business, society, friendships, and so on. It struck me that would be a good title. Let's just stop, take stock of where we're at, go back to first principles and think about how we might construct something differently.
Let's talk about the information and data that is collected through our use of the internet, the things we buy on Amazon, the pictures and videos that we share on Instagram and Facebook. You use the term surveillance capitalism to describe how that data is used. Can you explain what surveillance capitalism means?
Sure. This is a term that's been popularized by a business management professor from Harvard named Shoshana Zuboff. Actually, it was coined, as I understand it, by a Canadian-based professor named Vincent Mosco. And it's meant to describe the underlying business model of social media. And at the heart of it is this idea that the data that these companies can gather from us as we use their products and services becomes their property, and they use it in order to target advertisements and sell that data to third-party companies, other data analytic services and firms and so forth. It's a very simple concept. It's something that really emerged out of innovations, I believe, that Google undertook in the early 2000s, beginning with putting advertisements at the margins of their search results. And it has just exploded. So now virtually everything in social media is animated by this underlying business model. And the way I describe it in the book to help think about this is every application that you use has a higher and lower level function. So the lower level function is the apparent one. If you think about something like, let's say, Angry Birds. There's a game that we use as kind of fun. That's the lower level function. It's meant to entice us. But the higher level function is for the application to gather as much data about us, our devices, our social relationships, our movements, our habits, our preferences as they can. So there's a kind of relentless logic to this underlying business model.
Right. And that these applications, these social media apps that we all use, they're not really free because there's a reason why companies are putting them out and why they entice us.
That's right. It's a really clever, perhaps even cynical transaction that's happened. I think of it almost as a sleight of hand that's going on here, a kind of, a behind the scenes trick, if you will, because most of us, when we use these applications, we consent to terms of service that we routinely swipe through. Even if we could understand them, it would take all day to actually read through them. You'd be doing nothing but reading terms of service, right? But within those terms of service is a legal agreement. And the legal agreement specifies that the companies can gather all of this data from the users. So they're appropriating our personal data as their property. That is something unique in the history of capitalism, and it helps explain a lot of the problems that we see with social media. Because in order to accomplish this business objective, the companies have to make their products and services as attractive as possible. So the goal is to gather and retain people's attention. And that means investing in characteristics of the products and services that are compelling. Some of that is around the design features. So, bells going off, vibrations, this is like B.F. Skinner 101, right?
It's Pavlovian, right? It's like, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. Yeah.
Totally, exactly. However, it's being done on a mass scale with billions of people, right? So this is quite extraordinary psychological experimentation going on by these companies. But then it also explains the characteristics of the content. So the algorithms of the platforms propel forward emotional, extreme, sensational content. And the reason they do that is human nature being what it is, we tend to be attracted to that type of content instead of, dry, boring, the rational part of our brain. We're likely to be more compelled by content that taps into our emotions and our instincts that are subconscious is not quite the right word, but they're, subliminal in a way. This is what grabs us and keeps our attention and keeps us hooked on the platforms.
Yeah, we know that so many countless headlines have been written about how social media is not necessarily great for our mental health. There have been some steps taken, like Instagram. I think a few years ago, they eliminated the number of likes that a person can see on their picture. But it's clearly not enough, right? Neither are these digital walkouts like delete Facebook. Why is it so tough for us to quit social media when we know that it's not great for us?
There are two things there that are separate. Let me talk about the quitting part. That's a pretty simple explanation. I think when you are dealing with something that's designed to be addictive, it makes it very hard to quit by definition, right? These are products that tap into cognitive traits that have to do with our human nature that the designers have studied intensively. They employ neuroscientists to help them design features like, little bells going off, buzzers, vibrations, and so on. So on that level alone, it makes it hard to quit. But also, there is a kind of incentive structure that builds up over time as more people log on and as more of what you need to do as part of your day-to-day life involves committing to social media and their applications, booking a flight, going to a concert, ordering food, etc. There's an incentive structure that makes it difficult not to buy into it. So there's a good reason there why it's difficult for a lot of people to quit.
It's difficult to not pay attention to your phone when your phone is where you communicate with people. It is how you order food. For some people, it's how you date. It's more than just that device. It encompasses a lot of things about our lives.
And then, the point you're making about Instagram tweaking things like, only you can see the likes, or as we saw probably most dramatically with the election recently, where most of Donald Trump's tweets are flagged, right? So the companies are trying to make these adjustments to reflect the fact that they understand there is this growing understanding that there's a problem with their platform. So they're tinkering in the margins. But those little fixes are not likely to correct the underlying problem. Until you get at the underlying business model, it's kind of futile. It's like, working against a tide, a massive tide, right? Like you can swim against it and maybe you could try different strokes or something. But if the tide is pushing you in this direction, you're likely going to head that way.
So let's talk about that business model. We are in an attention economy. Social media companies, media companies, they prize engagement time very highly. They want to keep our eyes glued to what they offer. Is that actually an ethical business model?
Well, it could be. I think it depends on, how transparent the companies are about that and how accountable they are in terms of what they do. So as it stands now, most of the companies really have a problem, a transparency gap. So we know very little about how their inner workings are constructed, how their algorithms are programmed. And given that we are so surrounded and immersed by these technologies, to me, this is an obvious matter of public interest. We need to be able to pry open the companies, understand, okay, when you're sorting us into these categories and you're pushing content and advertisement towards us, how fair are those algorithms that you're using? And what are the decisions that are being made? They consider that proprietary, but obviously, given the scope and scale of the impact of their services, it's now become a matter of public interest, which is why I think we need to hold them to account.
We'll be right back. Right now, too, everyone has seen how quickly disinformation spreads over social media. And certainly companies like Facebook and Twitter, too, have come under fire for the kinds of information that they have allowed. Racist memes, disinformation, things that are anti-science, conspiracy theories. How do you think social media figures into how divided we're all becoming right now?
Well, I spent a bit of time on that in the book Reset. And the way that I look at this is, disinformation is an ancient practice. Propaganda, governments trying to fool their own citizens and rival governments. That's been something that's been going on for centuries, right? As long as humans have been around, we've lied to each other and tried to trick each other. So it's not that social media has created this. What's happened is, if you think about it as an environment, right? So social media, following this analogy, is kind of like a humid swamp, right? Like it's very wet and warm. And in those conditions, you're likely going to have a lot of mosquitoes breeding. And if you think about mosquitoes as disinformation operatives, that's kind of the situation we have right now. It's the perfect breeding ground for this type of experimentation around propaganda, influence operations, subversion, psychological operations, all these things that have quite a long history and in many cases have been well resourced by governments. A lot of capabilities put into it, are now finding themselves in a communications ecosystem that is perfectly ripe for those things to flourish. Why? Because the algorithms, as you rightly point out, like to surface this sort of content, right? Frankly, it sells better. It captures people's attention more effectively to have some crazy alarmist conspiracy than it does a careful dissection of the facts. There's also another characteristic of this ecosystem that makes it attractive for disinformation, which is simply the flood of information. So, we live in a unique time in that we're bombarded with bits of information coming at us from multiple sources. The term doom scrolling around Twitter that people use is kind of suggestive of this, right? You're just kind of...
It's mindless. Yeah. It feels mindless. Yeah.
Right. So in an environment like that, if you look at the properties of what's going on here, it makes it very difficult to discern fact from falsehood. It really creates challenges for those who want to point out errors in reasoning or question the veracity of a truth claim, because by the time something is in the public domain, and it could be a completely outlandish lie, like say something Rudy Giuliani has said about election fraud, by the time people can unpack it, dissect it, question the claims, look for sources, etc., a new scandal has come about. So we have this kind of cycle of intense bombardment of information that makes the discernment of fact from fiction incredibly challenging.
Right. And it's that old saying, right? Like a lie told a million times over at some point starts to become the truth, at least for some people.
That's right. Repetition of falsehoods increases their fluency. There are studies that I cite in the book that have shown this to be a remarkably effective dynamic. If a falsehood is repeated enough, if people see it enough, they start to believe it's true, even without looking into its veracity.
This sort of leads to an interesting quote that I was reading in The Atlantic. Barack Obama was speaking to them, and he was talking more specifically about the 2016 election and the influence that Donald Trump has had in our social political environment. And he said, this is a quote, "If we do not have the capacity to distinguish what's true from what is false, then by definition, the marketplace of ideas doesn't work. And by definition, our democracy doesn't work." So that all leads to a pretty existential place, right? Like, do you agree with the bigger question we're all facing?
Well, I do agree that this is a big problem. It's a problem that actually goes back hundreds of years, post-Enlightenment, post-modernity. There have been really since Nietzsche, people have been questioning whether we can establish a common sense of what constitutes truth. So that's been going on for a while now as part of just our evolution and how we as humans think about epistemology, our relationship between us as perceivers of the world and how we establish evidence and fact from falsehood. But what's happened in this environment is that type of temperament has really been amplified. And so you have social media propagating, extreme content. And then you have organizations, whether it's governments or private sector, perfecting the art of how to manipulate people's emotions and how to actually, cause chaos. Those who cause chaos right now stand to gain simply by just creating a kind of disorder. Usually it's the people who are authoritarian minded, right? They want to undermine any sense of accountability and really confuse and distract people. And it turns out that social media is the perfect environment within which to do that. So you have the multiple factors coming together to amplify this kind of postmodern sensibility that there is no truth, that everything is just an opinion. I'm entitled to an opinion as much as you. And thanks to social media, I have a bullhorn that allows me to broadcast whatever version of the truth I have to billions of people. So there's that alone. And then on top of it, of course, are the companies, the dark PR companies that are sprouting up, which we at Citizen Lab have been tracking, who are actually supplying services to corrupt kleptocrats and businesses to actually perfect the art of doing precisely that, confuse, distract, using social media as the vector through which to do this. So it's like a perfect storm of factors right now.
Right. Obviously, bad actors understanding the power of social media and using that to their advantage.
Completely. And it's not just the content side, like the falsehoods and echo chambers and filter bubbles. That can all be amplified by bad actors. But the bad actors also are able to exploit another aspect of the communications ecosystem, which is its inherent insecurity. So when you have an environment like the one we live in that is invasive by design, and where platforms and applications are quickly cobbled together and thrown at consumers, you have enormous insecurity. That's why we have data breaches. Almost on a daily basis, we hear about a new data breach. Well, having something like that is perfect for dictators, autocrats, and others who can exploit those fissures to hack into people's devices and see what they're doing and effectively neutralize them. I spend a chapter talking about that in Reset. And frankly, it's one of the most alarming parts of the equation right now, as far as I'm concerned. This kind of great leap forward in the capabilities of remote control for authoritarian-minded leaders.
I wanted to quickly touch on the part of your lecture where you talk about the environmental cost that our technology has, because, as we understand it on a day-to-day sort of level, like me at a computer, sending out emails and stuff, everything exists on the cloud, right? It feels like the technology is clean and reusable. But you write about how there is a real environmental, ecological footprint to everything we are doing, that it doesn't just exist like dust in the air, that there is a real cost to this.
Yeah, that was one of the most fun parts of the book to write in the lectures to prepare, because it was one of those areas where, although, much of what we talked about now, I think people are beginning to recognize, my perspective is that very few people appreciate the ecological footprint of social media and our entire communications ecosystem, from the mining and manufacturing. So all of the components that go into all of the electronics and the devices that we carry with us have to be dug up from the earth somewhere, usually using very energy intensive, polluting processes. Then there's the manufacturing, which involves a lot of waste, a lot of energy consumption, not to mention usually terrible conditions for workers in those factories. At the middle is the energy consumption. So, what we're doing right now, even though it seems like magic, is implicating a very large physical infrastructure. So, all of what we're doing right now has to go through wires and cables and tap into massive energy sucking data farms operated by these cloud computing companies. And then at the far end, of course, is the waste. So, planned obsolescence is not unique to social media, but it certainly has been accelerated by it. It's definitely a principal feature. We are trained basically and encouraged to upgrade to a new device with all sorts of peripherals and dongles and attachments that most of us have stored in like a plastic bin somewhere.
Yeah, it's like in a junk drawer somewhere.
In a junk drawer. Should I get rid of it or not? I don't know. But, all of this is exceedingly taxing on the environment at the very time that we're going through an existential crisis thanks to climate change. And the sad thing is that obviously information technology, computing systems, artificial intelligence, satellites are going to be essential to environmental rescue. The problem is the current way they're organized around this business model of surveillance capitalism is entirely dysfunctional to those aims. So we need to kind of recover all of this technology in order to apply it much more effectively to helping with environmental rescue.
I know that this conversation can be so overwhelming for somebody who's listening, because in so many factors, this impacts our lives, that we are the ones driving it. And it's a lot to take in. But I want to go back to where we started this conversation, because in Reset, you call for a reset in how we interact and use technology and social media. But what does that actually look like? What can we do on a human-to-human, day-to-day level that makes a difference?
Well, let me say, first of all, that Reset, at the heart of this idea of resetting and recovering and reclaiming the internet, is this principle of restraint, which is a seemingly very simple concept. Most people understand what it means, but it actually is a concept that is central to liberal democratic theorizing, going all the way back to ancient Greece. It's familiar to most people, I think, through concepts like checks and balances or the separation of powers. So at its heart is the idea that we need to make sure that whatever organizations, whether they're governments or private sector, who have power over our lives, we need to create an architecture around them of enforced transparency and accountability through mechanisms of restraint. So just to give you one example, going back to what we talked about earlier with respect to the algorithms of these companies, those companies should be forced to open up their proprietary algorithms to some kind of external public audit, right? That would be a major mechanism of independent restraint. And it could come in many different varieties. But at the heart of it is this idea of not letting the technologies and the big tech platforms just run away in an unbridled sense. It's how we think about carefully managing what they do in the public interest.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here.
With respect to individuals, I get asked this question a lot, and I understand where it's coming from. And sure, there are things we could all do to improve our habits and our digital hygiene and so forth, choices we make about browser extensions or like location sharing, that sort of thing. But I really do believe it's kind of unfair to put the burden on individuals in the same way that, we face, getting back to climate change, huge problems, existential problems. And yes, there are things that each of us could do differently. We could consume differently. We could recycle more. We could use less energy. But without getting at the larger structural problems, we won't fix the problem. And it's the same with social media. Yes, individuals can do little things to change their habits, but ultimately we need to get at the underlying business model of surveillance capitalism, which is driving a lot of the negative externalities we see throughout society.
As an individual, yes, we can make certain choices and change our behaviors, but to really fix this, it's on the companies and it's on the decisions we make around that.
That's right. And ultimately, those changes will only come by having governments enact laws and regulations that the companies will have to abide by. Because if we just leave it to them, Facebook, please, could you treat us more respectfully, it's not going to happen. They will find ways, they'll find workarounds, they'll fool us, frankly. So instead, it has to come through laws, which means, what can an individual do? Start at the local level, start in your municipality, elect people, and ask them to look into how governments and private sector companies in their local jurisdictions handle their personal data.
Ron, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on your show, Adrian. I really appreciate it.
And that is Ron Deeber, the director of Citizen Lab and the author of Reset, Reclaiming the Internet for Civil Society. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star Newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.